He came home 3 hours early and the house was not empty. Nico Vasquez had been in the car when the call came through, canceling the 2 o'clock scheduling conflict on the other side. His associate said, rescheduled for Thursday, and he had told the driver to take him home because there was paperwork he could do at the desk in the study, and because he had not eaten since 6 in the morning, and the restaurant near the office had been closed for renovation for 2 weeks, and he was tired in the specific way of a man who had been managing other people's problems since before sunrise. He had not called ahead. There had been no reason to call ahead. It was his house. The kitchen light was on. He saw it through the window from the motor court. The warm yellow of the overhead fixture rather than the under-cabinet lights Elena used when she was in there alone. And he registered this without attaching significance to it, because registration without significance was how he moved through most of the world. He came in through the side entrance, the one that opened directly to the kitchen, because it was closer, and he was carrying his jacket over one arm and wanted to put it down. He stopped in the doorway. Elena was standing at the island with her back half turned to him, and she was not alone. There were 4 women he did not recognize arranged in the kitchen, with the purposeful non-randomness of people who had been there long enough to find. Their positions, one at the table with a child in her lap, one near the window with a second child on her hip, one sitting on the counter with a phone pressed to her ear, speaking in low, rapid Spanish, and one standing close to Elena, her left arm held slightly away from her body, while Elena's hands moved over it with the focused attention of someone who knew what she was looking for. The arm had bruising that Nico could see from the doorway. On the island between them was a medical bag, open, with the organized contents of something that had been packed by someone who had done it many times. Nobody had heard him come in. He stood in the doorway for what he later estimated was 15 seconds. He was a man who had stood in many doorways and understood that the first 15 seconds of observation were worth more than any subsequent question. So he used them. He looked at the medical bag, the specific kind, canvas, with reinforced handles, the kind his people used when they needed treatment that did not require a hospital visit and did not create a paper trail. He looked at the children 8, maybe 9, and perhaps 4 years old, both quiet in the particular way of children who had learned that quiet was the correct response to adult tension. He looked at the woman on the counter, whose Spanish was too fast for him to catch all of it, but whose cadence was the cadence of someone arranging logistics. He looked at Elena. Her hands had not stopped moving. She had not heard him. He said, "Elena." The room went still. The woman on the counter lowered the phone. The woman near the window turned. Elena's hands paused over the injured arm and then, with the specific deliberateness of a person completing the action they were in the middle of before addressing the interruption, she finished what she was doing, set down the gauze she was holding, and turned to look at him. Her face was not the face of a person caught doing something wrong. He had seen that face on a great many people, and he knew it precisely, the rapid micro-calculations behind the eyes, the jaw that wanted to drop and was being held by effort, the hands that moved toward pockets or surfaces for the unconscious support of something solid. Elena's face was none of that. Her face was the face of a person who had known this moment would arrive at some point and had not decided until this exact second how to handle it, and was now deciding, and was doing so without apology. "You're home early," she said. "Meeting cancelled." He looked at the room again, not because he needed more information, but because looking at the room gave her time to finish deciding. And he had the instinct he could not have said where it came from, that he wanted her to finish deciding before he said anything else. "What do you need from me, right now?" The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long. He watched Elena absorb the question. He watched something in her expression shift, fractionally, in a way he did not have a name for yet. "Akar," she said. to an address I'll give the driver, and I need everyone to leave through the garden rather than the front." He took out his phone and called Marco, who was outside in the second car, and told him to come to the garden gate and to bring the Suburban and not to ask questions. He hung up. He looked at Elena. 20 minutes. 15 would be better. 15, he said, and stepped back out of the doorway to give the room space to move. He stood in the hall and listened to the controlled efficiency of what happened on the other side of the door. Low voices, the rustling of bags being packed, the sound of one of the children asking a question in a small voice and being answered quietly and at length by a woman who knew how to answer that kind of question. No panic, no rushing. The organized movement of people who had done this before, directed by someone who knew exactly what the next step was and the step after that. 11 minutes later, Elena came into the hallway. "They're ready." He walked them out through the garden himself, the 4 women and the 2 children and Elena, and stood at the gate while Marco loaded bags into the car. Back of the Suburban, with the professional discretion of a man who had been told not to ask questions and had extensive practice not asking them, he watched Elena crouch down to speak to the older child at eye level, her hand briefly on the child's shoulder. The child, looking at her with the serious attention of someone receiving information they intended to keep, he watched Elena stand and exchange a few words with the woman whose arm she had been treating. A look passing between them. That was the look of people who had a shorthand developed over time and were using it. He watched the doors close and the Suburban pull out, and Elena stand for a moment at the gate watching it go, her arms at her sides, the October air, moving her hair slightly. Then she turned and looked at him. They walked back through the garden without speaking. Inside, she went to the island and began putting the medical bag in order, her hands moving through the familiar routine of it. And he sat down on the stool across from her and watched her hands and waited. Because he was a man who had learned that the quality of what you heard depended entirely on the quality of how you waited. "How much of it did you see?" she said. "Enough to have questions." He paused. "The bag is the kind my people use." Her hands stilled for a moment on the clasp of the bag. Then she finished closing it and set it to the side and looked at him across the island. "I bought 6 of them 2 years ago from a supplier I found through your logistics contact. I paid in cash from household accounts. There's a line item in the quarterly review that your accountant flagged as miscellaneous medical supply, but didn't escalate because it was under the threshold." He absorbed this. "You knew about the threshold. I've been listening to you talk about operational finance for 3 years. She said it without challenge. Simply, "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back at him, and he was struck, as he had been struck at intervals throughout 3 years of marriage, by the particular quality of Elena's attention, which was the attention of someone who was always measuring something, always running a calculus he was not fully privy to. He had found it compelling when they met. He had married it. He was only now, standing in his kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon that had not gone as planned, beginning to understand that what he had found compelling was only the visible fraction of something considerably larger. "How long?" he said. She held his gaze. "Which part?" "All of it." He paused. "Start where you want to start." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense of a door that had been closed for a long time being considered from the other side. Then she pulled out the stool across from him and sat down, and she put her hands flat on the island between them, and she began. She had been doing this, she said, since she was 23 years old. Before him, before the life they had built together in this house, with its garden and its motor court and its kitchen, with the overhead light that was on now because 4 women and 2 children needed to see clearly. She had started with nothing, a network of 3 people, a protocol she had written herself, a cash reserve she had built from her salary over 2 years. She had learned as she went. She had made mistakes in the early years that she did not describe in detail, and he did not press her on them, because he understood that some accounting was done internally and did not require an audience. She told him what the network was, now 11 women in 6 cities, a protocol that had been refined over 9 years, resources that had grown as she had grown. She told him about the medical training she had done in the 2nd year. A course she had told him was a first aid certification for the charity board she sat on, which was true as far as it went and considerably incomplete. She told him about the address Marco had just driven to, a house in Westchester that belonged to a woman named Clara, who had been a part of the network for 4 years and who had a basement apartment that could house 2 families for up to 3 weeks. She told him all of it in the level, ordered way she did things, and he listened in the level, ordered way he did things. And the kitchen was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a room that had just held 8 people and was now adjusting to 2. When she finished, she looked at him. He had not moved from the stool. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen him use in meetings when he was processing something significant, not blank, not closed, but internally occupied, working through implications in the ordered way. His mind worked through implications. You used the threshold, he said. Yes, for 9 years. 3 years with your resources. 6 before that with my own. He was quiet for a moment. The Thursday afternoons. She looked at him. What? You go out on Thursdays. You say you're meeting friends. You've never named the friends. He said it without accusation, with the factual quality of a man noting what he had observed, and was now providing context for. I didn't ask, because I thought. He stopped. Because you thought what? He looked at his hands on the island. Because I thought you needed something that was yours. Something I wasn't part of. He said it slowly, as though the sentence was revealing itself to him as he spoke it. I thought I was giving you room. She looked at him across the island. He looked back at her. The overhead light was still on, the warm yellow of it over the space between them, and outside the garden was going the pale gold of late October afternoon. And neither of them said anything for a long moment. That was not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind of silence that occurs when 2 people are simultaneously arriving at the same understanding from different directions. You were, she said finally. You just didn't know what you were giving me room for. He nodded. It was a slow nod. The kind that is not agreement but acknowledgement. The kind that means, I am still here. I am still listening. I have not decided what I think yet, but I have not stopped. Tell me the rest, he said. So she did. The rest took another hour. She told him about the protocol, the 3-stage process she had developed over years of iteration. The first stage being extraction, getting the person out of the immediate situation. The second being stabilization, which was medical and logistical. And the third being transition, which was the longest and the hardest, and the one that failed most often, not because of resources but because of the person herself. Because leaving was not a single decision, but a series of decisions made, repeatedly, under conditions that were designed to make the decision impossible. She told him about the failures, which she counted with the precision of someone who had spent years refusing to round down. 7 women in 9 years who had gone back. 2 she had lost track of entirely. 1 she knew about and did not speak of in detail, and he did not ask her to. She told him about the funding the household accounts. Yes, but also a small consulting income she had maintained under her name from before their marriage. Work. She still did 2 or 3 times a year for organizations she had relationships with, and which generated enough to cover the costs that could not come from the household accounts without triggering the threshold. She had maintained the consulting work deliberately, she said, because she had known from the beginning that financial independence was not a luxury but a mechanism, and she had treated her own situation with the same pragmatism she applied to anyone else's. Nico listened to this particular sentence twice, internally, before he let it pass. She told him about the network, how it had grown from 3 people she trusted personally to 11 people she trusted professionally, a distinction she drew carefully, and what the difference meant in practice. She told him about Clara in Westchester, who had lost a sister 20 years ago and had never spoken about it publicly and never would, and who ran the transit house with an organizational rigor that Elena described with something that was not quite pride, but was in the neighborhood of it. She told him about a woman in Miami and a woman in Chicago and a woman in Portland who did what Clara did, in slightly different configurations, for slightly different populations, with slightly different needs that Elena had learned to anticipate and provide for over the years. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'm not going to apologize for it. I didn't ask you to. I know. I'm telling you because I want to be clear that I've thought about whether I should, and I've decided I shouldn't, and I'm not going to do it anyway, just to make this easier." He looked at her across the island. "Have I suggested, I want you to make this easier?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "You haven't." He got up and went to the refrigerator and looked at it for a moment, and then made the decision that had been pending since 6 in the morning and took out the materials for a meal. He cooked while she sat on the stool and watched him, and neither of them said anything for a while, and he was aware of this silence as a different kind of silence than the ones they had occupied together before. Not the comfortable silence of 2 people who knew each other, but the more complex silence of 2 people who were revising what they knew about each other in real time and had tacitly agreed to give the revision room to happen. He made pasta because it was what the refrigerator had and because he did not want to wait for something more considered. He set 2 plates on the island and sat back down across from her. She ate without commenting on the food, which was how she always ate when she was thinking about something else. And he ate and thought about what she had told him and assembled the pieces of it against the 3 years of marriage he had on file, looking for the places where the new information changed the shape of what he had thought he understood. There were more places than he had expected. The Thursday afternoons, he said again. Yes. And the charity board. Yes. The certification was real. The reason I wanted it was what I told you now. He put down his fork. The trip to Chicago in February. She looked at him steadily. Yes. You said it was your college roommate's birthday. It was also her birthday. I was there for 2 days. One day was her birthday dinner. One day was the network. He absorbed this. He thought about February, which had been a difficult month operationally. A dispute with a supplier that had required 3 trips to New Jersey and more phone calls than he wanted to remember. And he thought about Elena in Chicago for 2 days. And he thought about the fact that he had not called her on the 2nd day because he had been in a meeting that ran until 11 at night, and he had sent a text instead. And she had replied quickly and warmly, and he had been relieved that she did not seem bothered by his absence, and had not examined why he had been relieved. "You've been doing this our entire marriage," he said. "Yes. And before. Yes. And you didn't tell me." He said it without accusation. He was looking for the sentence that was true and accurate and did not collapse into something simpler than what it actually was. "Because you didn't think I would." He stopped. Elena put her fork down too. She had the expression she wore when she was deciding how precisely to say something. "Because I didn't know what you would do," she said. "Not because I thought you would make me stop. I want to be clear about that. I didn't think you'd forbid it." She paused. "I thought you might try to run it." He was quiet. "You manage things," she said, not unkindly. The way she said things that were simply true. "It's what you do. You see a system and you want to understand how it works, and then you want to make it work better, and then you want to make sure it's protected, and then, at some point, you're running it. Not because you're trying to take it over, Because that's how you love things. You make them more efficient and you make them safer and you put resources into them and then they're yours. She looked at him. This was the one thing I had that was mine before you. I didn't want to find out whether I was right about what would happen to it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the garden had gone from gold to the deeper shadow of early evening. Nico looked at his wife across the island, with the pasta. Neither of them was eating anymore, and he thought about the specific accuracy of what she had just said, and the specific discomfort of recognizing yourself in a description you could not argue with. You might have been right, he said. I know. I'm not sure I would have. He said it carefully, because he was a man who did not make claims he was uncertain of. I don't know what I would have done. I've been trying to figure that out for the last 2 hours. And I think, he paused, I think I would have wanted to understand it. And then I would have wanted to make sure you were safe. And then I would have wanted to add resources. And then he stopped. He looked at his hands. And then I'm not sure. Elena looked at him for a long moment. That's honest, she said. It's the best I can do right now. She picked up her fork. He picked up his. They ate for a while in the revised silence, which had changed again, shifted into something that was less about revision and more about the strange, particular intimacy of two people who have just said true things to each other that they had not said before and are now sitting with the weight of that in a kitchen where the overhead light is still on. Ask me, she said. He looked up. Whatever you're holding, she said. Ask it. He put down his fork again. He thought about the question he had been not asking for 2 hours, the one that sat underneath all the other questions about protocol and funding and Chicago in February. Why the medical training? He said. You could have referred everyone to someone else. You had enough of a network by the 2nd year to... Because the first time someone came to me with an injury, I didn't know what to do, she said. And she waited while I figured it out, and she was in pain the whole time she waited. And I decided that was the last time I was going to be the reason someone waited. She said it simply, the way she said things that had been settled a long time ago. So I learned. He was quiet for a moment. How long did the course take? 14 weeks. Evening classes. I told you I was doing a book club. He thought about 14 weeks of Tuesday evenings the previous year, when he had gone to sleep in a house that was quiet, because Elena was out, and he had read, and sometimes worked, and had not thought much about it, because Elena had always had the capacity to organize her own evenings, and he had respected that. He thought about the particular passivity of respecting something you don't examine. I didn't ask about the book club, he said. No, because I was giving you room. Yes. He looked at her. How many books did you read? For the first time since he had walked through the door that afternoon. Elena smiled. It was a small smile, contained, but it was there. Tvo, she said. In 14 weeks. I read very fast. He felt something in his chest do something that was not quite laughter, but was in the same family as it. He did not let it become laughter, because this was not a moment for laughter. But he felt it, and she saw him feel it, and that exchange, the thing felt, and the thing seen, was its own kind of communication that did not require a name. What I should have asked, he said, is what you were doing on Tuesday evenings. Yes. I should have asked about the Thursdays. Yes. I should have asked about Chicago. Yes. She looked at him across the empty plates. And I should have told you. I'm not putting it all on your side. I made choices too. She paused. I decided you couldn't handle knowing. And I never gave you the chance to prove me wrong. That was mine. He picked up both plates and took them to the sink and ran the water and stood there for a moment, with his back to her and the water running over his hands. Cold, because he hadn't adjusted it, which he did not notice until it had been running for a while. He turned off the tap. He turned around. "Cô cần gì từ anh?" he said. It came out in Spanish, not Italian, which was not a language he spoke regularly, but which was the language she had grown up in, and which arrived now without his consciously choosing it, the way some things arrive when the ordinary register of a person isn't sufficient. She looked at him from across the kitchen. Her expression did something he did not have a word for, in any language. "Right now," he said, switching back. "Tonight. What do you need?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I need you to not decide anything tonight," she said. "About what happens next. About the network or the resources or any of it. I need you to just—" She stopped. "I need one night where this is something you know, and you're not doing anything about it yet." He nodded. "All right. Just that. I heard you." He moved away from the sink. "Come and sit in the other room. I'll make coffee." She came. He made coffee. They sat in the room that faced the garden and drank it while the dark finished settling over the trees outside. And he did not make any decisions. And she did not make any explanations. And the house was quiet, in the way that houses are quiet, when the people inside them have said the things that needed saying and are now simply present with the fact of having said them, which is its own kind of rest. Brescia came on a Thursday. Elena knew it was possible before it happened, in the way she always knew things were possible, not as premonition, but as probability calculation. The trained assessment of someone who had spent 9 years anticipating the ways situations could deteriorate. The woman whose arm she had treated her name was Sonia. Elena had learned it properly now. In the 2 days since Tuesday, had a husband who was the kind of man who kept track of things. And Sonia had not been careful enough leaving. And careful enough was a standard Elena held to strictly with everyone in the network, precisely because of the kind of man Sonia's husband was. But Sonia had been frightened and had moved faster than the protocol allowed, and Elena had made the judgment call to proceed anyway because the alternative was not proceeding. And judgment calls were sometimes wrong. She was in the study when the gate camera alert came through on the secondary phone, the one Nico did not know about, which was a sentence she was aware had a shorter shelf life than it used to. She looked at the screen. 2 men she did not recognize, and a third man she recognized from the photograph Sonia had shown her, taken at a distance, which was the standard documentation request she made of everyone who came through the network. Brescia was a wide man in his mid-40s, with a particular physical confidence of someone who had spent decades being the largest person in most rooms. He was standing at the gate with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was looking at the camera with the directness of someone who did not mind being seen, which was its own kind of communication. She went to find Nico. He was in the kitchen, which was where he had been for most of the morning, working at the island with his laptop and 2 phones, and the particular concentrated stillness he brought to work that she had always found. Despite everything, something close to beautiful, he had not made any decisions last night. As promised, he had made coffee, and they had sat in the garden room, and he had asked her 2 more questions, careful, specific questions, the kind that showed he had been listening, and she had answered them, and they had gone to bed without resolving anything, which was what she had asked for, and he had honored it without appearing to require credit for doing so. She set the secondary phone on the island in front of him without speaking. He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he looked up at her. When did they arrive? Just now. The alert just came through. He turned the phone over and looked at it again. He looked at the man in the center of the frame. This is the husband. Yes, he knows you're here. He knows Sonia came here. He may not know who I am. He knows the address. She paused. The gate camera is visible from the street. He knows he's been seen. Nico was quiet for a moment. He closed his laptop. He set both phones face down on the island with the deliberate neatness of someone clearing a surface before beginning a different kind of work. He stood up and took his jacket from the back of the chair and put it on. And she watched him do this, and thought about the fact that she had watched him put on that jacket 100 times and had never before seen it as a form of preparation, though it had probably always been one. "Stay inside," he said. "Nico, not because I'm managing you." He looked at her directly, because if he sees you, it becomes about you and Sonia. And right now it's about him and me. And that's the more useful configuration. He paused. "Do you trust that assessment?" She looked at him. "Yes." "Then stay inside." He picked up one of the phones, not the secondary, his own, and typed something briefly and put it in his pocket. "Marco is at the east gate. He'll stay there." He went out through the garden. Elena went to the window in the study, which had an angle on the front gate that the kitchen window did not. She stood to the side, so she was not visible from the street, and she watched. Nico walked to the gate without hurrying. He had a particular walk that she had noticed when they first met. A walk that was not aggressive or performative, but that communicated something through its simple evenness. The walk of a man who had decided his pace and was not going to change it based on external conditions. He stopped at the gate. He did not open it. He looked at Brescia through the iron and said something she could not hear through the glass. She had expected, she realized now, watching, that she had expected a version of this that was recognizable. She had seen, in 9 years, how men like Brescia responded to different approaches, and she had expected Nico to use the approach she associated with his world, the implicit threat, the display of resources, the communication of consequence through tone and positioning. She had prepared herself, internally, for something that would be effective, but that would confirm the part of her that had always understood who she had married. What she saw was not that. She could not hear the words, but she could read the posture. Nico had his hands at his sides, not in his pockets, not crossed the neutral position of a man who was not performing readiness because he did not need to perform it. He was not leaning forward. He was not using the gate as a prop. He was simply standing and speaking with the quiet, directed attention of someone who had decided this was a conversation worth having carefully. Brescia said something. His posture was different forward. Weight shifted. The posture of someone accustomed to using his physical size as an opening statement. He said something else. She saw his hand come out of his pocket. Nico did not move. He said something that took longer than the things he had said before. She watched Brescia's posture shift, fractionally. In the way. Posture shifts when something unexpected has been introduced into a situation that was expected. She had seen that shift before she had learned to look for it in the men who showed up looking for the women in her network. The moment when the confrontation they had scripted internally encountered something that did not fit the script. The two men behind Brescia exchanged a look. Brescia said something shorter. Nico responded, and she saw him gesture once, not toward the men, not toward the house, but toward the street behind them. A gesture that was not dismissive, but directional, which was a different thing entirely. He was showing them a way out. He was doing it in a way that allowed them to take it without the gesture reading as a defeat. It took 4 more minutes. She counted. She had learned to count in situations like this, because counting gave her something to do with her attention that was not catastrophizing, which was the habit she had built in place of the more available habit of panic. At the end of 4 minutes, Brescia took 1 step back, then another. He said one more thing, directed at Nico, and Nico nodded once in the way of a man acknowledging that something has been said without agreeing that it has been said well. Then Brescia turned, and his 2 men turned with him, and they walked back to the car at the curb and got in and drove away. Nico stood at the gate until the car had turned the corner. Then he turned around and walked back through the garden. Elena was in the kitchen when he came in. She had moved from the study window because standing at the study window was making her feel like someone waiting to be told what happened. And she had never been comfortable with that particular feeling. She was standing at the island with a glass of water she was not drinking when he came through the garden door. He looked at her. She looked at him. "He's gone," he said. "I saw." She set down the water. "What did you say to him?" He came to the island and sat down on the stool, and was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet, when he was finding the right words, rather than organizing words he already had. I told him that his wife had received medical attention at this address as a guest of mine, and that guests of mine were under my protection, and that he was standing outside my house. He paused, and then I told him that I understood that he believed he had a claim on her, and that I was interested in that claim, and that I thought we could find a way to discuss it that was productive for him. She looked at him, and then I told him what I knew about his business, not as a threat, as information I happened to have. He looked at his hands on the island. I told him that men in his position sometimes found it useful to consult with people like me on matters of mutual interest. I told him I had found it useful, in my experience, to expand my circle of consultation. He paused. I told him that I was interested in speaking with him further, at a time and place that was convenient for him, about what that might look like. Elena was quiet for a moment. "You offered him something. I gave him a reason to leave that was not retreat. That's not what you would usually do." He looked up at her. "No," he said. "It isn't." She held his gaze. "Where did that come from?" He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes looked at her when he was deciding whether to say the exact thing he was thinking or a version of it. She watched him decide to say the exact thing. "You told me last night that leaving isn't a single decision," he said. "You told me it was a series of decisions made under conditions designed to make the decision impossible. And you told me that the transition stage failed most often not because of resources but because of the person." He paused. I thought about what that meant, about what makes someone able to make the decision again after they've made it and taken it back. And it seemed to me that part of it was whether the alternative to staying had a shape they could live inside, a shape that wasn't only loss. He looked at her, so I gave him a shape. The kitchen was very quiet. Elena looked at her husband sitting at the island in the jacket he had put on to go out and deal with a man at the gate, and she thought about 9 years of a protocol she had built alone, carefully, with the resources available to her, and she thought about the word resources and what it had meant before and what it might mean differently now. "He may not take it," she said. "He may not. The shape has to be offered. Whether they take it is their decision." He paused. "You know that better than I do." She did know that. She had known it for 9 years, and it had cost her something every single time. She picked up the glass of water and drank it, finally, and set it down and looked at him with the specific look she reserved for things that required more time than she currently had to fully understand, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement. He used the language. She said, "Just now, you said whether they take it is their decision. That's the language I use when I'm training someone new." He looked at her evenly. "I've been listening to you for 3 years. You've never heard me talk about the network." "No," he said, "but I've heard you talk about other things. How you talk to people on the phone when you think I'm not in the room. How you talk to the woman who cleans for us when she was having trouble with her landlord last spring. How you talked to my cousin's wife at Christmas when she said something was fine, and you looked at her the way you look at things you've decided to think about later." He paused. "I've been listening. I just didn't have the context." He looked at her. "Now I have the context." Elena stood at the island for a long moment. She thought about 3 years of a marriage she had believed was real and good, and had still kept a major part of herself outside of, and she thought about what it meant that the part she had kept outside was visible in the way she talked on the phone and the way she looked at women who said things were fine. And she thought about a man who had noticed these things and filed them and carried them for 3 years without knowing what they meant, and had just, in 4 minutes, at a gate, used them correctly without being taught. "I underestimated you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "In this specific way," he said. "I underestimated you and others." She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the garden was mid-morning still, the light through the old trees doing what it did in late October, finding the angles that made everything look briefly like a painting of itself. She thought about the woman in Miami and the woman in Chicago and Clara in Westchester and the 14 weeks of Tuesday evenings and the threshold she had known about for 3 years and the threshold she was standing at now, which was different and did not have a number attached to it. "We should call Clara," she said. "I need to check on Sonia." "Yes." He stood. "Use the secondary phone. I'll make calls about Brescia from the study and let you know what I find out." She looked at him. "You're already finding things out about Brescia." "I started last night," he said. "After you went to sleep. I thought it was likely he'd come." He picked up his phone from the island. "I didn't make any decisions. I gathered information. Those are different things." She looked at him for a moment and thought about the particular precision of that distinction, which was a distinction she herself had made 100 times to the women in the network when they were afraid that wanting information meant they had already decided something, and which was true, and which was also, she understood now, not the whole truth, because information was never entirely neutral, and gathering it was always, on some level, a preparation. "All right," she said. He went to the study. She picked up the secondary phone and called Clara, who answered on the first ring and said Sonia was sleeping and the children had eaten breakfast and there had been no contact from outside. And Elena said good and told her about Brescia coming to the house, and Clara was quiet for a moment and then said, "How did it go?" And Elena said, "Better than I expected." And Clara, who had known Elena for 4 years and knew her precisely, said, "That's not nothing." And Elena said, "No, it isn't." She hung up and stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of Nico on the phone in the study, the low, even cadence of him working, a sound she had fallen asleep to on many nights through the walls of this house. And she thought about what it would mean to have the next part of her life be less alone than the last part had been, and she found she did not have language for it yet, which was all right. Some things needed to be lived before they could be named. Her mother's name was Rosa. Elena had not said the name out loud in a long time, not because she had forgotten it, not because it caused the kind of pain that makes names unspeakable, but because there had not been anyone to say it to in the right way, which was the way you say a name when the person you're saying it to understands what you are actually saying. She had said it to therapists, and the therapists had responded with the appropriate professional warmth, and it had felt like speaking into a space designed to absorb rather than receive. She had said it to friends, early on, and their faces had done the thing faces do when they are trying to be present for something they cannot fully imagine. And she had learned to be grateful for that, and had also learned that gratitude and feeling understood were not the same thing. She said it now to Nico. In the kitchen, on a Friday morning the day after Brescia, with the October light coming through the windows in the particular way it came at this hour, when the sun was still low, and the garden threw long shadows across the stone floor. And she said it simply, as in introduction times her name was Rosa, and then she told him. She told him about the house she had grown up in, which was beautiful in the way that houses maintained by people with resources and considerable investment in appearances are beautiful, the right furniture, the right art, the right neighborhood, in the right city, the kind of house that communicated something specific about its occupants to everyone who walked through the door, and that communicated something different, once you lived there long enough, to the people who could not leave. She told him about her father, who was not a violent man in the ways that were legible, He did not break things. He did not raise his voice above a certain register. He did not produce evidence that would have been admissible anywhere, and who was, nevertheless, the reason her mother spent 23 years in a state of managed diminishment that Elena had not had language for as a child, and had spent the subsequent years building language for, because language was the only tool she had found that actually fit the shape of the thing. She told him about the morning when she was 21 years old and home for the summer, and she had come downstairs early and found her mother in the kitchen. Sitting at the table with a cup of tea, she was not drinking, looking at something outside the window that was not there. And Elena had sat down across from her and asked her what she was thinking about, and her mother had said nothing. Mia. Nothing. The way she said everything, that was not nothing. And Elena had looked at her and had understood for the first time, with the full weight of adult comprehension, that this was not something her mother was going to solve. That her mother had made her peace with it in the specific way of someone who has run the calculus so many times that the calculus itself has become the life. She told him that she had driven home from that summer and had spent 3 months being unable to sleep and had then started doing something about it, which was the condensed version of a process that had been rather longer and more disorganized than that sentence suggested, but which was true in its essential shape. Nico listened. He was at the island across from her with his coffee, and he listened the way he listened when he was not thinking about what he was going to say next, which was differently than most people listened, with a quality of attention that was not trying to get anywhere, but was simply present with what was being said. And she found, in the telling, that the name did not feel the way it usually felt. It felt like something being handed to someone who could hold it. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "My father's name was Carmine." She looked at him. "He died when I was 19. He said, 11 years ago. Heart attack, which is what it was listed as, and which was also true." He paused. He was not a kind man. He was not unkind in ways that were legible. Either. He was the kind of man who decided what things were and then lived in the world he had decided. And the people around him lived in it too. He looked at his coffee. "My mother left when I was 12. She is still alive. She lives in Portugal. I speak with her 4 or 5 times a year." Elena said, "You've never told me she lives in Portugal." "No. You've told me she passed away." He looked up at her. "Yes. Pause. I told you that when we first met, at a dinner. When you asked about my family, and I didn't know you yet, and that was the version I had been giving for 7 years, because it ended the conversation in the right place." He held her gaze. "I should have told you the truth when I did know you. I didn't, because telling you the truth meant explaining why I had told you the other thing. And explaining that meant explaining my father. And explaining my father was—" He stopped, started again. It was not something I had done. Elena was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the dinner he was describing, which she remembered, at a long table in a restaurant she had liked, early enough in knowing him that she had been paying close attention to everything. And she thought about the answer he had given to the question she had asked about his family, and she thought about the specific care she had extended to him over that answer, the way she had not pressed or followed up, because she had understood it was a tender place. And she thought about the fact that the care she had extended had been care extended to a fiction and had perhaps, without either of them intending it, helped the fiction stay in place. "We're in Portugal," she said. He looked at her. "Outside Lisbon, a town called Cascais. She has a house near the water." He paused. "She gardens. She has a dog. She is, I think, happier than she was in any period of my childhood that I can remember." "Have you visited her?" 3 times in 11 years. The last time was 4 years ago." He was quiet for a moment. "She asks about you. I've told her about you." Elena absorbed this, a woman outside Lisbon who knew she existed. who gardened and had a dog and was happier than she had been, who had been asking about her. A woman she had been told was dead. She sat with this for a while without speaking, because it required sitting with, because it was not a simple thing and she did not want to make it simple by responding to it too quickly. She left when you were 12, she said. Yes, and your father ran things, ran the family, ran the business. I was 19 when he died, and I took over what he had built because I was the one who was there. And because I had been being prepared for it, whether I had agreed to be prepared for it or not. He paused. I was not like him. I want to be clear about that. I have spent a significant amount of effort being not like him. I know, she said. I know you're not like him. But you built a house where the person who loves you doesn't feel she can tell you what she does with her time. She said it without accusation, with the same directness she had been using since Tuesday. Because the directness was the only register available to her that was not also a performance of something. That's not what he did, but it has the same shape in some places. He was quiet for a long time. She watched him be quiet, and she did not fill the quiet, and she did not soften the sentence, because the sentence was true, and she had meant it as information, not as a wound, and she trusted him to receive it as information, because he had been receiving things as information since he walked through the kitchen door on Tuesday afternoon. Yes, he said finally. It does. She nodded. He nodded. They sat in the kitchen with their coffee and the October light moving across the stone floor and the particular weight of two true things said in the same morning, which was more true things than either of them had said to each other in 3 years, and which was not comfortable exactly, but was something better than comfortable. It was the feeling of a room that has been aired out after a long time of being closed. The slight cold of the fresh air, along with the relief of it. What do you need? He said. From me. Going forward. I'm not asking what I'm allowed to do. I'm asking what would actually help. She thought about this seriously, which was how she thought about things. I need you to know what I'm doing without trying to improve it, she said. At first, for a while, I need you to have the information and sit with it without making it yours. All right. That will be difficult for you. Yes, he said. It will. I know. She looked at him. I'm asking anyway. I understand. He turned his coffee cup on the island. 1/4 turn. The way he turned things when he was thinking. And after a while we can talk about what it would look like if there were more resources, what that would mean for the protocol, what it would change, and what it wouldn't. She paused, but that's a different conversation for a different time. When you're ready, when I'm ready, she looked at him steadily, and when you've demonstrated that you can have the first thing without immediately converting it into the second, he looked at her with the expression she was beginning to think of as his honest expression, the one that was not managed for the room but was simply what his face did when he had stopped managing it. That's a fair condition, he said. I know it is, she said. I said it. He almost smiled. She saw it arrive and be contained. And she thought that 3 years of marriage had perhaps not been entirely wasted if she could now see the smile that didn't quite happen and know what it meant. She refilled both their coffees. She sat back down. The morning was proceeding outside the windows in the ordinary way of mornings that have not been informed of what has happened inside the house, and the garden was doing what it did in October, which was losing things with a grace that made the losing look like something other than loss. And she thought about her mother in a kitchen in a different house, looking at something outside a window that was not there, and she thought about what she had built in the years since that morning. And she thought about Sonia sleeping in Westchester, and the woman in Miami, and the woman in Chicago, and Clara with her organizational rigor and her lost sister. And she thought about the man across the island from her who had gone to a gate yesterday and given a difficult man a shape that was not only loss, I want to tell you something, she said. He looked at her. What you did yesterday. At the gate. She held his gaze. I've been doing this for 9 years, and I have never had anyone do that. In the right way. With the right language. She paused. That mattered. He was quiet for a moment. It was your language. He said. I was only using it. I know, she said. That's why it mattered. The kitchen was warm and the coffee was good, and outside the garden went on doing what it did, patient and unhurried. And for the first time, in 3 years of mornings in this house, Elena felt the specific quality of being in a room with someone who knew where she had been. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough that the room felt different, not larger, but more fully occupied. The way a room feels when the people in it are actually in it, present to each other, and not only to their own carefully maintained versions of the life they were sharing. She did not say any of this. She drank her coffee. Nico drank his. The morning light moved across the floor, and the garden shadows shortened as the sun rose, and somewhere in Westchester, 2 children were eating breakfast, and a woman with a healing arm was sleeping. And the day was beginning in the ordinary way of days that contain, if you knew where to look, everything that mattered. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in December, Nico came downstairs to find Elena at the island with the secondary phone and a cup of coffee and a legal pad covered in her handwriting. And he made himself another coffee and sat down across from her without asking what she was working on, because he had been practicing, not asking what she was working on, and he had gotten, in 6 weeks, considerably better at it than he had expected. She looked up. She looked back down. She made a note on the legal pad. Then she said, without looking up, Clara thinks we need a 4th transit location, somewhere between Chicago and the West Coast, Denver or Salt Lake. He drank his coffee. What does the current gap look like? 18 to 22 hours of travel time depending on origin point. That's too long for the stabilization window in a crisis extraction. She turned a page on the legal pad. The problem is finding someone with the right combination of space and discretion, and, she paused, someone who understands what they're taking on. He turned his coffee cup 1/4 turn. I know someone in Denver. She looked up. A woman, he said. She runs a restaurant. She has a house outside the city with a guest structure that's separate from the main building. She has been doing something similar. I think, in a less organized way, for some years. He paused. I became aware of it through a separate matter. I've never mentioned it to her because it wasn't my business to mention. He looked at Elena. It might be worth a conversation. Elena held his gaze for a moment. How did you become aware of it? Someone I was dealing with professionally made a comment that suggested he knew where his wife had gone. He was wrong about the address, but he described a house outside Denver that matched what I knew about this woman's property. He was precise and unhurried, giving her the information in the order that made it comprehensible. I filed it. I didn't do anything with it, because there was nothing to do with it at the time. And you didn't tell her you knew? No, because it wasn't yours to tell. He looked at her. Yes. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she wore when she was measuring the distance between what she had expected and what she was getting. Then she looked back at the legal pad. Send me what you have on her. I'll reach out through the network rather than through you. It should come from inside. Of course. He picked up his coffee. There's also a property in Salt Lake that became available last month. Commercial zoning, but residential conversion is straightforward. I've been holding it without doing anything with it. She looked up again. How long have you been holding it? 3 weeks. That's doing something with it. I bought it, he said. I haven't done anything with it since I bought it. Those are different things. He said it with the specific evenness of a man who had heard his own distillation used against him and had made peace with that. Elena put her pen down. She looked at him across the island with the full attention she brought to things that required it. which was the attention he had married and which he was only now. 6 weeks into knowing what it was actually doing in the hours he was not present for, beginning to understand the full scale of, "You've been sitting on a property in Salt Lake for 3 weeks. She said, "Yes, without telling me. I was waiting until you were ready to have the second conversation." He looked at her steadily. "You said when you were ready. I was waiting." She was quiet for a moment. "That was the condition. Yes, you actually honored it." "I told you I would. People say they'll do things," she said, "and then the thing is right there, and the impulse to just do it is very strong, and most people—" "I'm aware of what most people do," he said. "I'm also aware of what I usually do. I sat with the property for 3 weeks, and I did not do anything with it, and it was—" He paused. It was not comfortable. Elena looked at him. He looked back at her. The December morning was doing what December mornings did in this kitchen, the light coming in low and cold through the garden windows. The house quiet in the particular way. It was quiet before 9, which was a quietness she had always loved about this hour and had always occupied alone. She was not alone in it now. She was not sure yet what to do with that except to be in it. "The property in Salt Lake," she said, "is yours to do with as you see fit. I can transfer it to whatever structure makes sense for the network. Or I can sell it and put the funds somewhere you designate. Or I can continue to hold it while you decide." He paused. "Any of those is fine. The decision is yours." She picked up her pen. She wrote something on the legal pad. She did not tell him what she wrote, and he did not look. "I'll talk to Clara," she said. "And the woman in Chicago. They have more context on the West Coast gap than I do." She paused. "And I'll reach out to your contact in Denver. Through the network." "All right." She wrote something else. Then she set the pen down again and looked at him with the expression he had been learning for 6 weeks and had not yet finished learning, which was the expression of someone who was updating a model that had been built over a long time and was finding the update more significant than anticipated. "I want to say something," she said. "All right. I was wrong about what you would do." She said it plainly, which was the register she had used since October, and which he had come to understand was the highest form of respect she offered, not softened, not managed. Just the thing itself. Not completely wrong. You did try to give her a shape. She paused. "But I was wrong about whether you could sit with something that was mine and not make it yours. I didn't think you could. I was wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "You weren't entirely wrong," he said. "I bought a property." "You bought a property and sat on it for 3 weeks." "I did. That's different from what I thought you'd do." "Yes," he said. "It is." He turned the coffee cup. "I want to say something also." She waited. "I have been thinking about what you said, about the house having the same shape in some places." He looked at the coffee rather than at her, which was how he said the things that required the most from him. "You were right, and I want to be clear that I understand it was not intentional. I understand that the distance between intention and effect is not an excuse. I am not using it as one." He looked up. "But I want you to know that I have been thinking about it seriously, and I think I understand better now how it happened, which is that I built the shape of a house where I controlled the information because controlling the information was how I kept things safe. And I did not see, until you showed me that the same shape that kept things safe also kept things alone." He paused. "I don't want to keep building that shape." Elena looked at him across the island. The legal pad was between them and the 2 phones, and the December light and 3 years of marriage being revised in real time, which was not a comfortable process, and which was also, she was finding, the most genuinely inhabited she had felt in this kitchen since she moved into it. "What does that look like?" she said. "In practice, I think it looks like this," he said. "You tell me when something comes up that I should know about." I tell you the equivalent. Not everything. There are things in my work that you don't need and shouldn't have, for reasons that are practical rather than controlling. But the things that affect us, the shape of the life. He paused. And when I find something that's relevant to what you're doing, I tell you rather than sitting on it for 3 weeks. That would have been useful 3 weeks ago. Yes, he said. It would. She almost smiled. He saw it arrive, and this time he let his own arrive too. Briefly, just enough to be there. And that exchange, the almost smile, meeting the almost smile, was the closest thing to levity they had had in 6 weeks, and it felt, she thought, like the right amount of it for where they were. She picked up the secondary phone. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it down on his side of the island. He looked at it. He looked at her. Not the network contacts. She said, "Those are mine. But the operational structure, the protocol documentation, the resource tracking, the transit location records." She paused. "You can read them. If you want to understand what it actually is, rather than the version I've been describing." He did not pick up the phone. "When you're ready for me to." "I'm telling you now." "I know. I'm asking if now is when you want me to." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Now is when I want you to." He picked up the phone. He looked at her once more. Briefly. The look of a man who understood what was being given and was not going to treat it as anything other than what it was. Then he looked at the phone and began to read. And she picked up her pen and returned to the legal pad. And the kitchen was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of 2 people working in the same room with full knowledge of what the other was doing, which was a different quiet than the one she had occupied in this kitchen for 3 years, and which was, she thought, the right quiet for the house she actually wanted to live in. At 10:30, she made more coffee. At 11, Nico put the phone down and said, "The intake documentation in stage 1. You're doing it in writing." She looked up. "Yes, that creates a paper trail. It creates a record that belongs to the network, not to any outside system. I understand that, but if the record is ever accessed..." He stopped. He looked at her. "You've thought about this. For 9 years. Right." He was quiet for a moment. "There's an encryption system I use for certain internal records. I'll send you the contact who built it. If you want it, the decision is yours." She looked at him. "That's the second time you've said the decision is yours." "I'm practicing," he said. This time, the smile happened. Not the contained version. Not the managed version. It arrived, and she let it stay. And he saw it. And something in his expression settled in the way of a thing that has been waiting at a careful distance and has just been told it can come closer. It was a small moment. It was the right size for where they were, which was not at the end of something, but at the beginning of something that had taken 3 years and 1 Tuesday afternoon and 6 weeks of deliberate practice to get to the starting point of. She wrote the contact name on the legal pad when he gave it to her. She wrote it in the same handwriting as everything else on the page, without ceremony. Because it did not require ceremony, it was just the next item, the next practical thing. The network growing by one more connection, in the ordinary way that networks grow when the people inside them have decided to let them. At noon, she called Clara. She told her about Denver and Salt Lake, and Clara was quiet for a moment and then said, "Where did the Salt Lake property come from?" And Elena said, "My husband found it." And Clara was quiet for another moment and then said, in the precise tone of a woman who had known Elena for 4 years and was making an adjustment, "All right then." And Elena said, "Yes." And Clara said, "I'll look at the maps." After she hung up, she sat for a moment at the island. Nico was in the study. She could hear him on the phone, the low, even cadence of it, the particular voice he used when he was being careful, which was a voice she had heard through the walls of this house for 3 years, and which she knew now she would hear differently, not with more trust. Because trust was not the thing that had been missing, but with more comprehension. The specific comprehension of someone who has been let into the room the voice is coming from and can now hear what is being said, rather than only that something is being said. She looked at the legal pad. She looked at the secondary phone. She looked at the kitchen, which was the room she had run 3 years of a secret life from, which was also just a kitchen, which was also the room Nico had come home to on a Tuesday in October and had stood in the doorway of for 15 seconds and had then asked her what she needed. She thought about that question. She thought about all the forms it had taken in 6 weeks at the gate, in the study, over the Salt Lake property. This morning, with the coffee and the legal pad and the encryption contact, she thought about the fact that it was always the same question, underneath, wearing different practical clothes, and that she had spent 3 years believing no one in this house was asking it and had been wrong about that too. In the specific way you are wrong about things when you stop looking because you have decided in advance what you will find. She picked up the pen. She wrote one more thing on the legal pad. At the bottom of the page, separate from the network notes, Times ask Nico about Cascais. Plan a trip. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to make lunch, and the house was warm. And through the study door, she could hear him finishing his call. And the December light was coming in through the garden windows in the way it came at this hour. And it was an ordinary morning in a house that was, she thought, finally beginning to be the house she had actually moved into, not the one she had kept herself small inside, but the one where she took up the full amount of space that was hers, which turned out to be more than she had let herself need for a very long time.